The mechanical ventilator hissed at **11:14 p.m. It was a rhythmic, pathetic sound, a wheeze that belonged to a dying man, not a god. Kang Yi-hyun, the man whose name used to silence the streets of Seoul, was currently a prisoner of his own lungs. His eyes moved, tracking the dust motes dancing in the sterile light of his bedroom, but his fingers remained frozen on the silk sheets. He was a king in a fortress, surrounded by 10,000 cameras and 300 armed guards, and yet he had never been more alone. The door groaned open. There was no wobble in her step, no hesitation, just the soft, clinical friction of cotton against skin as **Yoon Seoyeon** entered the room. If you loving this story, please like and subscribe to my channel. Let's get back into the story. The lieutenants in the hallway called her the Shadow. The doctors called her the Help. But as she approached the bed, Yi-hyun saw her for what she actually was, the only person in the world who wasn't afraid of his corpse. She didn't bow. She didn't offer the performative grief his brothers in arms had been faking for weeks. Instead, she reached out and pressed a cold, damp cloth to his forehead. Her skin was dark against the pale, sickly sweat of his brow, a stark, beautiful contrast in a room that smelled of expensive cologne and impending rot. "They're arguing in the study, Yi-hyun," she said. Her voice was like velvet over gravel. She was the only person in the mansion who dared use his name without a title. "They've already decided which of your ports belong to them. They're even dividing up your cars." Yi-hyun's jaw tightened. He wanted to roar. He wanted to tell her to get his gun, to call the loyalists, to burn the house down with everyone in it. But all that came out was a jagged, wet cough. Seoyeon didn't flinch. She leaned over him, her face inches from his, her eyes searching his as if she were reading a map only she could see. She wiped a stray drop of blood from his lip with her thumb. "The world thinks you're a monster," she whispered, her breath warm against his cold skin. "But monsters are easy to kill. It's the men who think they're gods that are hard to break." She reached for the IV drip, the one keeping the mysterious illness at bay. Her fingers lingered on the plastic tubing. For a second, the power dynamic in the room shifted so violently it felt like the floor had tilted. He was the boss. He owned the building, the city, the law. But she owned the air in his lungs. She leaned closer, her lips brushing the shell of his ear, a gesture so intimate it felt like a violation. In the hallway, a guard coughed. In the distance, a siren wailed. But in this room, there was only her voice. "I love you," she whispered. Yi-hyun's eyes snapped wide. His heart rate monitor began to spike, a frantic asterisk beep 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 that echoed his panic. It wasn't the words that terrified him. It was the way she said them. She didn't say it like a lover. She said it like a collector who had finally found the last piece of a broken set. "And because I love you," she continued, her eyes locking onto his with a terrifying, lucid depth, "I'm the only one who's going to let you live long enough to see them all burn." She turned the dial on the IV. Yi-hyun felt a sudden, icy rush through his veins. He tried to speak, but the darkness was already pulling him under. The last thing he saw was Seoyeon standing over him, her expression as calm as a prayer, watching him sink into the sleep she had crafted for him. Everything had changed. The tiger was no longer in the cage. The cage had become the tiger's only sanctuary. The light in the room was a surgical white, the kind that stripped the soul of its shadows. When Yi-hyun drifted back into consciousness, the first thing he tasted was copper, the metallic tang of a tongue bitten during a seizure, or perhaps the lingering ghost of the IV she had adjusted. He tried to move his right arm, a limb that had once broken jaws and signed death warrants, but it felt like a lead weight anchored to the mattress. The door clicked. Seoyeon entered, carrying a small, lacquered tray. On it sat a bowl of simple juk rice porridge and a glass of dark, amber liquid. She moved with a terrifying grace, her footsteps making no sound on the heavy rugs. "You've been under for 12 hours, she said, her voice a calm melody that set his nerves on fire. "The elders from the Busan branch came by. I told them you were too focused on the restructuring to be disturbed. They didn't push. They're afraid of catching whatever you have." She sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping under her slight weight. She blew on a spoonful of the porridge and held it to his lips. Yi Hyun clamped his jaw shut. His eyes, dark and burning with a trapped ferocity, bored into hers. He didn't want her medicine. He didn't want her love. He wanted to wrap his hands around her throat until she told him what she was putting in his veins. "Eat, Yi Hyun," she murmured. "Strength doesn't come from spite." He managed to force his voice through a throat that felt like it had been scrubbed with sand. "What did you give me?" Seoyeon's expression didn't change. She didn't flinch at the venom in his tone. She simply lowered the spoon and picked up the amber glass. "I gave you a chance. Outside that door, your nephew is already checking the balance of your offshore accounts. Your head of security is taking meetings with the triads. I am the only thing standing between you and a shallow grave in the woods." "You're drugging me," he wheezed, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. With a sudden, violent burst of will, Yi Hyun surged upward. It was a pathetic movement by his old standards, but he managed to knock the glass from her hand. It shattered against the floor, the liquid staining the white rug like a spreading bruise. He reached for her, his fingers clawing at the collar of her uniform, desperate to feel the pulse of a person he could break. But his muscles failed halfway. The world tilted, his vision fracturing into 1,000 jagged pieces. His body slumped back, twitching, the neurological disconnect making him feel like he was falling through the bed. Seoyeon didn't pull away. She leaned into his space, her hands moving to pin his weak wrists against the silk sheets. She wasn't heavy, but she was immovable. She looked down at him, her eyes full of a strange, grieving tenderness that was far more frightening than any threat. "I told you," she whispered, her lips almost touching his forehead. "Love is the only thing that keeps the monsters at bay, but love requires discipline." He tried to spit at her, but his mouth was too dry. He was a prisoner in his own skin, watching the woman who had been a shadow in his house for years reveal herself as his master. "Don't struggle, boss," she breathed, the term of respect sounding like a mockery in the quiet room. She leaned closer, her weight pressing into his chest, forcing him to feel the steady, calm beat of her heart against his frantic one. "You'll only hurt yourself, and I hate it when you're hurt. Look at the door, Yi Hyun. Listen to the silence. No one is coming, no one is calling. I've sent them all away." She reached down, picked up a stray piece of glass from the rug, and held it up so he could see his own reflection in the shard, a pale, broken version of a king. "I'm the only one left," she whispered, "and I'm the only one who's going to keep you." As she picked up the bowl to try the porridge again, Yi Hyun realized the copper taste wasn't blood. It was the taste of the cage door locking from the inside. The mansion breathed with a heavy, expensive silence that Yi Hyun had once mistaken for peace. As he lay paralyzed, watching the ceiling fan spin like a slow, hypnotic blade, his mind retreated from the copper-tasting present into the fog of the past. He searched for the moment the ghost had first entered his halls, trying to find the crack in his armor he had missed. 3 years ago, she had been nothing more than a blurred figure in a gray uniform, one of a dozen silent spirits hired to polish the mahogany and disappear before the sun hit the courtyard. He remembered the night he had first truly noticed her, not because she had stood out, but because she was the only thing that didn't change when the world became violent. It was the night of the Busan betrayal. Yi Hyun had returned to the mansion covered in another man's blood, his adrenaline screaming, his hand still gripped tight around a serrated blade. His guards had scrambled, their boots thundering on the marble, their voices tight with panic. But Seoyeon had simply appeared at the end of the hall with a basin of warm water and a fresh towel. She hadn't looked at the blood. She hadn't looked at his trembling hands. She had looked only at his eyes, a gaze so steady it felt like a tether. "You're late, boss." She had whispered then, her voice as cool as the water she carried. "The tea has gone cold, but the bath is ready." At the time, he had taken her composure for loyalty. He saw her as a tool, efficient, unbreakable, and beneath his notice. He didn't see the way she lingered in the doorway of his study, her eyes tracking the rhythm of his breathing as he slept. He didn't notice that she was the one who curated his environment, learning that he favored the scent of cedar over sandalwood because it masked the metallic tang of his work. Day by day, She had mapped the geography of his life. She knew that he held his glass with his left hand when he was lying, and that the slight twitch in his jaw meant he was seconds away from a lethal outburst. She learned his secrets not by stealing files, but by observing the things he threw away. The half-smoked cigarettes, the crumpled notes, the way he hesitated before drinking water that hadn't been poured by her hand. In his delirium now, the memories flickered like old film. He saw her standing in the shadows of the library a year ago, watching him struggle with a recurring migraine. She hadn't offered medicine then. She had simply dimmed the lights and hummed a low, vibrating melody that seemed to resonate with the pain in his skull. He had fallen asleep to that sound, never realizing she was training his body to associate her presence with relief and her absence with agony. She had been a scientist, and he was her primary subject. She had waited for the precise moment when his empire grew too heavy for his shoulders, watching for the subtle tremors in his hands that signaled the onset of his illness. He realized now, with a sickening clarity, that she hadn't just chanced upon his collapse. She had been the architect of the silence that followed it. Back in the present, the ghost moved toward the window, pulling the heavy velvet curtains to block out the morning sun. The room plunged into a soft, artificial twilight. She turned toward him, her face partially obscured, yet her eyes remained the only sharp thing in his blurred world. "You used to say that information was the currency of our world, Yi Hyun," she said, her voice pulling him back from the past. She walked to the bedside, her fingers trailing along the edge of the mahogany desk where he used to sign death warrants. "But you were wrong. Information is just noise. Observation. That is where the power lies." She sat back down on the edge of his bed, leaning over him until her shadow swallowed his entire frame. "I know you better than you know yourself. I know the exact frequency of your heartbeat when you're afraid. And right now," she whispered, her hand moving to stroke his hair with a terrifying, rhythmic devotion, "you're terrified. But don't worry. I've spent 3 years learning how to fix you, and I've spent a lifetime learning how to keep you." Rain hammered against the reinforced glass of the master's suite, a relentless, percussive sound that masked the treachery brewing downstairs. Yi Hyun lay propped up against the pillows, his breath shallow, watching the heavy oak doors. He could hear them now, the heavy, rhythmic thud of polished Oxfords on the marble. It was a sound of confidence, of a man who no longer felt the need to walk softly in the presence of a king. "He's awake, but the fever is high," Seo-yeon whispered, her voice shrinking into the timid, hollow tone of a servant. She opened the doors just wide enough to let him in. Park Min-hyuk, the syndicate's second-in-command, stepped into the room. He smelled of expensive tobacco and rain. He didn't offer a bow. He didn't even remove his overcoat. He simply stood at the foot of the bed, his eyes scanning Yi Hyun's pale face with the clinical detachment of a man looking at a piece of fruit that had sat too long in the sun. "Yi Hyun," Min-hyuk said, his voice booming unpleasantly in the quiet room. "The board is getting restless. The docks in Incheon are a mess, and the police are sniffing around the warehouse in Gangnam. We need signatures. We need a face. And you look like a ghost." Yi Hyun tried to speak, but his vocal cords felt like they had been frayed by wire. He could only manage a sharp, wheezing rattle. Behind Min-hyuk, Seo-yeon moved like a shadow. She was kneeling by the nightstand, fussing with a tray of discarded bandages and empty vials. To Min-hyuk, she was part of the furniture, a background detail in a house of fatting glory. He didn't notice the way her hand hovered near the base of a heavy bronze lamp, or the tiny, blinking red light of a high-gain microphone she had concealed within the folds of a fresh linen cloth. "It's a shame," Min-hyuk continued, stepping closer until he was looming over Yi Hyun. He reached down and adjusted the lapel of Yi Hyun's silk pajama top, a gesture of mock intimacy. "You built this empire on the idea that weakness is a death sentence. It's only fair that you follow your own laws, isn't it?" Min-hyuk turned slightly toward the door, speaking to the guard standing just outside. "Tell the others, we move on Friday. If he's still breathing by then, we'll help him stop. There's no point in dragging this out. A clean break is better for the business." The guard nodded, and Min-hyuk laughed, a dry, rasping sound. He looked back at Yi Hyun, a predatory smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Rest well, boss, it's almost over." As the heavy doors clicked shut and the footsteps receded down the hall, the silence returned, heavier than before. Sioyeon didn't move for a long moment. She remained on her knees, her head bowed in the posture of a submissive maid. Then she stood. The timidity vanished from her face, replaced by a cold, sharpened focus. She reached into the linen and pulled out a small, sleek recording device. She tapped a button, and Min Hyuk's voice filled the room again, clear and damning. "We move on Friday. We'll help him stop." She walked to the bedside and looked down at Yi Hyun. He was shaking, a mixture of rage and impotence vibrating through his thin frame. He looked at the recording, then at her, his eyes pleading for a weapon, for a phone, for anything he could use to strike back. "They think they're the vultures," Sioyeon said softly, her thumb tracing the edge of the recorder. She leaned over him, her silhouette blocking out the dim light of the hallway. "But they've forgotten one thing. Vultures only eat what is already dead, and I haven't decided to let you go yet." She tucked the recorder into her apron pocket and reached for a fresh basin of water. Her touch was cooling, but her eyes were fixed on the door with a terrifying, predatory patience. "Friday is a long way off, Yi Hyun," she whispered. "A lot can happen in the dark." The sound of the rain intensified, sealing them together in the quiet room. The king who had lost his crown and the woman who was building a new one out of his secrets. The clock on the mantel struck midnight, the chimes sounding like the tolling of a funeral bell in the cavernous silence of the bedroom. Outside, the rain had settled into a low, rhythmic thrum, but inside, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and the metallic tang of Yi Hyun's mounting terror. He could feel the deadline Min Hyuk had set pressing against the walls of the room. Friday was coming, and with it, the end of his life. Sioyeon was moving through the room with her usual, maddening deliberation. She extinguished the lamps one by one until the only light remaining was the ghostly blue flicker of the heart rate monitor and the pale moonlight bleeding through the gaps in the curtains. She approached the bed, not with the tray of food or the basin of water, but with nothing at all. Her hands were empty, and her eyes were dark pools that seemed to swallow the little light that remained. She sat on the edge of the mattress, the springs groaning softly under her weight. For the first time, she didn't begin her clinical routine. She simply watched him, her gaze tracing the hollows of his cheeks and the frantic pulse at the base of his throat. Yi Hyun stared back, his mind screaming for his muscles to move, for his fingers to wrap around her neck, for anything that would break the suffocating spell of her presence. "Do you know why I haven't left you, Yi Hyun?" she asked, her voice a mere vibration in the dark. "Every other soul in this house has already packed their bags or sharpened their knives. They see a carcass. They see a vacuum where a king used to be." She leaned forward, her shadow stretching across his chest like a shroud. Her hand rose, her fingers cold and steady as they traced the line of his jaw. She didn't flinch when he tried to pull away, a movement that amounted to nothing more than a pathetic twitch of his head. "I've spent 3 years in the corners of your rooms," she whispered. "I've watched you break men for less than a sideways glance. I've watched you walk through fire without blinking. And through it all, I realized that no one really looked at you. They looked at your power. They looked at your money. They looked at the fear you inspired." She leaned closer still, her hair brushing against his cheek, the scent of jasmine and antiseptic filling his senses. The heart rate monitor began to accelerate, asterisk beep 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 asterisk, a mechanical witness to his rising panic. He saw the reflection of the blue light in her pupils, making her look like something ancient and predatory. "But I saw the man," she breathed, her lips inches from his ear. "I saw the way you held your breath when you thought you were alone. I saw the fracture in your soul. And I realized that a man like you can only be truly held when he has nothing left to hold on to." She pressed her palm against his chest, right over his hammering heart, as if she were claiming the organ itself. The intimacy was suffocating, a physical weight that made it hard for him to draw air. "I love you," she whispered into the shell of his ear. Yi Hyun's eyes widened, the blue light of the monitor catching the moisture in them. The words should have been a comfort, a reprieve in a house of traitors. But as they left her lips, they felt like a sentence. He looked at her, really looked at her, and realized that this wasn't the love of a woman for a man. It was the love of an artist for her masterpiece. It was the love of a jailer for her most precious prisoner. "I love you," she repeated, her voice gaining a terrifying, melodic weight. "And that is why you will never leave this room. That is why I will be the last thing you see every night and the first thing you see every morning. You don't belong to the syndicate anymore, Yi Hyan. You don't belong to the streets or the law." She leaned back just enough to look him in the eye, her expression one of pure, unadulterated devotion that made his blood run cold. "You belong to me," she said, her thumb brushing over his lower lip with a possessive finality. "I have stripped the world away from you piece by piece until only I remain, and I will never let you go." As she leaned down to press a soft, lingering kiss to his forehead, Yi Hyan realized that the vultures outside were the least of his problems. The woman who loved him was far more dangerous than the men who wanted him dead. In her eyes, he wasn't a boss or a man. He was a possession, and she had finally brought him home. The silence of the room was shattered at 3:14 a.m., not by a scream, but by the rhythmic, metallic asterisk click of a suppressed pistol sliding into battery. Yi Hyan, paralyzed in the half-light, felt the shift in the air before he saw the intruder. The door didn't creak. The shadows simply detached themselves from the hallway and bled into the room. It was one of Min Hyuk's personal shadows, a man named Kale, a cold-blooded cleaner Yi Hyan himself had once put on the payroll. Kale moved toward the bed with the efficiency of a ghost, a serrated blade glinting in his left hand and a silenced weapon in his right. Yi Hyan's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic asterisk thud-thud-thud that felt loud enough to wake the dead. He watched, helpless, as Kale raised the pistol, aiming for the center of Yi Hyan's forehead. The king was about to be executed in his own bed, and he couldn't even close his eyes to meet the end. Then, the darkness behind the intruder moved. Seo-yeon didn't come from the door. She emerged from the heavy velvet curtains behind the vanity, moving with a speed that defied human physics. There was no maid left in her posture. The soft, rounded shoulders were gone, replaced by a terrifying, lethal geometry. Before Kale could pull the trigger, Seo-yeon's hand shot out, her fingers catching his wrist with a sickening asterisk crack. The pistol discharged, a muffled asterisk fut asterisk. The bullet buried itself in the headboard inches from Yi Hyan's ear. In the flickering blue light of the monitor, Yi Hyan watched a transformation that broke his understanding of the woman who had spent years cleaning his floors. Seo-yeon didn't struggle. She dismantled. She drove the heel of her hand into Kale's throat, crushing the windpipe in a single, clinical strike. As the assassin gasped, she seized his knife hand, twisted it with a fluid, terrifying grace, and buried his own serrated blade deep into the soft tissue beneath his chin. There was no emotion on her face, no adrenaline-fueled rage. Her expression was the same one she used when she folded his laundry, focused, precise, and utterly detached. Kale collapsed onto the silk sheets, his blood erupting in a dark, hot spray that painted the white pillows and Seo-yeon's pale face. She didn't flinch. She stood over the dying man, her hand still steady on the hilt of the knife, watching the light fade from his eyes with the cold patience of a professional. She wasn't a maid. She wasn't an obsessed fan. She was a specialist, an elite, a predator who had been hiding in plain sight, waiting for the world to thin out until she was the only one left to guard the prize. Slowly, she turned to look at Yi Hyan. The blood on her cheek looked like a jagged war paint in the moonlight. She reached out, her fingers still stained with the intruder's life, and gently wiped a stray drop of blood from Yi Hyan's eyelid. "He was early," she whispered, her voice returning to that soft, melodic lilt. "Min Hyuk is getting impatient. He doesn't realize that I've already mapped every entry point in this house. He doesn't realize that I was trained by people who make his syndicate look like children playing with matches." She leaned down, the scent of copper and jasmine overwhelming Yi Hyan's senses. She placed her blood-slicked hand over his heart, feeling the frantic rhythm she had claimed as her own. "Are you afraid, Yi Hyan?" she asked, her eyes searching his with a terrifying, lucid depth. "Don't be. The blood on the silk isn't yours, and it never will be. I didn't spend 3 years studying your every breath just to let a common thief take you from me." She stood up and began to drag Kale's heavy body toward the service elevator hidden behind the wardrobe, her strength far exceeding her slight frame. As the door closed behind her, Yi Hyun lay in the gory ruins of his bed, the heart rate monitor screaming. For the first time, he realized that the mysterious illness wasn't his only prison. He was being kept alive by a woman who killed with the same effortless devotion she used to tuck him in. He wasn't just her possession, he was her mission, and there was no one left in the world to save him from his savior. The smell of iron and jasmine lingered long after Seo-yeon had scrubbed the silk sheets clean. She had replaced the ruined linens with a fresh, crisp set of Egyptian cotton, but to Yi Hyun, the room still felt like a slaughterhouse. As the first gray light of Thursday morning touched the curtains, Yi Hyun felt a strange, electric tingle in his right hand. The numbness that had turned his body into a tomb was receding, replaced by a dull, throbbing ache. It was a small mercy. Perhaps she had adjusted his dosage, or perhaps his sheer rage was finally overriding the chemicals in his blood. He didn't move. He kept his breathing shallow and rhythmic, mimicking the mechanical wheeze of the ventilator. He watched her from behind hooded eyelids. She was across the room, meticulously cleaning the bronze lamp she had used to shield him. She was humming a soft, haunting tune, her movements fluid and calm, as if she hadn't ended a man's life just hours before. Slowly, agonizingly, Yi Hyun slid his right hand beneath the edge of the mattress. His fingers brushed against cold steel. The weight of the Beretta 21A Bobcat was comforting, a compact, lethal secret hidden there months ago for a betrayal he thought would come from his lieutenants, not his help. His finger found the trigger guard. The metal felt like ice against his skin, but the cold was grounding. He had one shot, one chance to end the devotion that was killing him. Seo-yeon turned, sensing a change in the room's atmosphere. She didn't look at the bed first, she looked at the heart rate monitor. The numbers were climbing. She walked toward him, the gray maid's uniform whispering against her legs. "You're awake early, Yi Hyun," she said, her voice a gentle caress. "Your color is returning. It seems the love I'm giving you is finally taking hold." She sat on the edge of the bed, her weight familiar and suffocating. She reached out to brush a lock of hair from his forehead. Yi Hyun's grip on the gun tightened. All he had to do was pull his hand out, press the muzzle to her chest, and pull the trigger. He could end the drugged meals, the midnight confessions, and the terrifying stillness of his life. He could call the loyalist guards at the gate, take his empire back, and wash the scent of jasmine from his skin forever. But as she leaned closer, her eyes searching his with that unsettling, lucid depth, he looked past her, at the door. Min Hyuk would be here tomorrow. The syndicate's second-in-command wouldn't come alone. He would come with a dozen shooters, a legal team to forge the signatures, and the cold intent to erase Yi Hyun's legacy. If Yi Hyun killed Seo-yeon now, he would be a paralyzed king sitting on a throne made of glass, waiting for the executioner. He looked at Seo-yeon's hands, the steady, blood-stained hands of a specialist who had dismantled a professional assassin without breaking a sweat. The gun was heavy in his grip, a tool for an ending, but Seo-yeon was a weapon for a beginning. "Yi Hyun," she whispered, her brow furrowing slightly. She leaned in, her lips almost touching his. "Your heart is racing. Are you trying to tell me something?" He let go of the gun. He didn't pull his hand out from the mattress. Instead, he forced his fingers to move, reaching out to graze the fabric of her sleeve. His touch was weak, but the intent was clear. It wasn't an act of affection. It was a surrender of his pride to her competence. "Help me," he rasped, the words tearing at his throat like shards of glass. Seo-yeon froze. A slow, terrifyingly beautiful smile spread across her face, not the smile of a lover, but the smile of a general who had finally secured the ultimate asset. She took his hand in hers, her grip like iron, and pressed it to her cheek. "I thought you'd never ask, boss," she breathed. "I've already prepared the list. Min Hyuk, the board, the traitors at the docks, we'll burn them together. But remember," she leaned in, her voice dropping to a lethal, possessive chill, "when the fire is out, you're still mine." Yi Hyun closed his eyes. He had made his choice. He would use the devil to reclaim his hell, even if it meant he could never leave the cage. The dinner was set for 8:00 p.m. on Friday, held in the grand dining room that smelled of beeswax and cold anticipation. Yi Hyan sat at the head of the long obsidian table, his body held upright by a custom-molded brace hidden beneath his tailored charcoal suit. To the eye, he was the tiger restored. To his own nerves, he was a hollow statue, his strength a fragile illusion maintained by the cocktail of stimulants Seoyeon had injected into his hip an hour ago. Seoyeon moved around the table in her gray maid's uniform, her eyes downcast, the perfect image of a silent servant. She placed the appetizers, delicate plates of sea urchin and gold-flecked sashimi, with a hand that was unnervingly steady. Min Hyuk sat to Yi Hyan's right, his expression a mask of poorly concealed confusion. Behind him, 4 other board members sat in stiff silence, their eyes darting between the sick boss and the exits. They had come expecting to sign a death warrant. Instead, they found a ghost hosting a banquet. "You look remarkably well, Yi Hyan," Min Hyuk said, his voice echoing in the vast room. He picked up his silver fork, but his hand trembled slightly. "The rumors of your decline were clearly exaggerated." Yi Hyan didn't answer immediately. He took a slow, deliberate sip of water, the glass heavy in his hand. He felt Seoyeon's presence behind his chair, a silent, lethal anchor. He could feel the heat of her gaze on the back of his neck, reminding him that he was only as strong as she allowed him to be. "Rumors are weapons, Min Hyuk," Yi Hyan finally rasped. His voice was deeper now, a rough growl that filled the space. "But silence is a grave." Seoyeon stepped forward, clearing the plates with a fluid grace. She replaced them with the main course, a traditional braised short rib, the steam carrying the faint, sweet scent of pear and something sharper, something metallic. As the board members began to eat, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The stimulants in Yi Hyan's system were peaking, making every sound, the scrape of silver against porcelain, the heavy breathing of the traitors, magnified and grotesque. "I've spent the last few weeks in reflection," Yi Hyan continued, his eyes locking onto Min Hyuk's. "Watching the people I trusted prepare for my funeral, it's a rare gift, seeing who is ready to scavenge before the heart even stops beating." Min Hyuk dropped his fork. It clattered against the plate with the finality of a gunshot. He tried to stand, but his knees buckled, and he slumped back into his chair, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. Around the table, the other board members were clutching their throats, their eyes wide with a sudden, paralyzing realization. Seoyeon didn't stop moving. She walked to the sideboard and poured a glass of vintage red wine, bringing it to Yi Hyan's lips. She held the glass for him, her fingers brushing his chin with a possessive tenderness that made the dying men gasp in horror. "The taste of copper," Yi Hyan whispered, looking at Min Hyuk. "I told you I was drugged, didn't I? It seems Seoyeon found the supplier. She thought it was only fair that you understood the sensation of a body that no longer belongs to you." Min Hyuk tried to speak, but only a wet, bubbling sound emerged. The illness that had plagued Yi Hyan for weeks was now tearing through the traitors in a concentrated, lethal dose. Seoyeon leaned over Yi Hyan's shoulder, her face inches from his, her eyes watching the light fade from Min Hyuk's pupils. She looked like a priestess at an altar. "The purge is complete, boss," she whispered, her voice a soft, melodic contrast to the gasping sounds of the dying. Yi Hyan looked at his lieutenants, the men he had built an empire with, as they slumped over their gold-rimmed plates. He felt no triumph, only a cold, hollow weight. He turned his head slightly, meeting Seoyeon's gaze. "You said these were my last words," Yi Hyan said, his voice steady for the first time. He looked at Min Hyuk, who was staring at him with a final, pleading terror. "In my world, there is no such thing as loyalty," Yi Hyan delivered, the words cold and final. "There is only ownership, and tonight I've decided who owns the silence." Seoyeon smiled, a terrifyingly beautiful expression of victory. She placed her hand over his heart, feeling the steady beat as the room fell into a permanent, expensive quiet. The dinner was over. The house was clean, and the cage was now the only world that remained. The scent of blood had been scrubbed from the dining room, replaced by the crisp, biting aroma of eucalyptus and expensive floor wax. 1 month had passed since the purge, and the syndicate had never been more profitable. From his desk on the penthouse floor of the mansion, Yi Hyun watched the city lights of Seoul flicker like a sea of diamonds. He was healthy again. The tremors were gone. His grip was like iron, and his voice once more commanded the kind of silence that made grown men tremble. But the throne felt different now. It was no longer a seat of absolute power, but a pedestal inside a gilded cage. He heard the soft, familiar click of the door. He didn't need to look up to know it was her. Seo-yeon entered, carrying a small silver tray with a single glass of water. She wasn't wearing the maid's uniform tonight. She wore a silk dress the color of midnight, her dark skin glowing against the fabric, her presence filling the room with an authority that surpassed his own. She placed the water on his desk. Yi Hyun looked at the glass, then at her. He knew with a chilling certainty that the mysterious illness had never been a virus or a genetic fluke. He remembered the way she had looked at him in the darkness of his paralysis, the clinical devotion, the way she had curated his agony just to be the one to solve it. He knew she had been the one to slip the first dose into his tea 3 years ago, a slow-acting poison designed not to kill, but to colonize. She had dismantled his life, so she could rebuild it around herself. "You're working late, Yi Hyun," she said, her hand coming to rest on his shoulder. Her touch was warm, but it felt like a brand. "The board is stable. The traders are buried. You should rest." Yi Hyun reached up, his fingers wrapping around her wrist. For a moment, the old hunter flickered in his eyes, the man who could have crushed her windpipe and walked away. But as he looked into her calm, lucid gaze, he felt a terrifying wave of relief. He didn't want to be the tiger anymore. He didn't want the weight of the world on his shoulders without the safety net of her shadow. He realized he didn't want to drink water that she hadn't poured. He didn't want to sleep in a room she hadn't secured. "I can't rest," he rasped, his thumb tracing the pulse in her wrist. "Not without you." Seo-yeon smiled, and for the first time it wasn't a mask. It was a victory. She leaned down, her lips brushing his ear, mirroring the midnight confession that had changed everything. "I told you," she whispered. "I'm the only one left. And I'm the only one who will ever truly keep you." The power had shifted irrevocably. The world saw Kang Yi Hyun as the restored king of the underworld, more ruthless and efficient than ever. They didn't see the way he looked at his wife, the woman they still thought was a lucky maid. They didn't see that every order he gave was a reflection of the silence she maintained. The hunter had been tamed, not by a stronger predator, but by a prey that had rewritten the rules of the forest. Yi Hyun took the glass and drank. He didn't care if it was medicine or poison. As long as it was hers, he would swallow it whole. Hash the final revelation and life lesson asterisk. The revelation that Seo-yeon was the architect of his illness from the very beginning is the ultimate gothic noir twist. It transforms the story from a traditional romance into a asterisk psychological thriller about obsession and agency. It reframes every act of care in the previous chapters as an act of calculated sabotage, making her, "I love you," the most dangerous weapon in the story. The life lesson, asterisk. True power isn't found in who you can command, but in who you cannot live without. The story warns that asterisk vulnerability is the ultimate leverage. In seeking absolute security, Yi Hyun traded his freedom for a protector, realizing too late that the person who has the power to save you is the only person who truly has the power to destroy you.